The sun glints off polished metal as the queen's guards drag her through the forum. Her golden chains, so massive that two soldiers must bear their weight, swing with each step. The crowd presses forward, thousands of faces turned toward her in a mixture of hunger and fear. The smell of unwashed bodies and roasted meat fills the air. Children sit on their fathers' shoulders, craning to catch a glimpse of the famous queen, now reduced to this. This is what defeat looks like in Rome. Not the quick mercy of death on a battlefield, not a negotiated exile to some distant province. This is something far more calculated, far more cruel. This is the systematic erasure of everything a woman with a crown once was. The legal machinery of conquest transformed not just armies and territories, but the very people who ruled them, reducing queens to objects, monarchs to property. When Queen Zenobia of Palmyra heard that the Roman legions under Emperor Aurelian were approaching in 272 CE, she understood the mathematics of power better than most. She had built an empire that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia, had challenged Roman authority across the entire eastern frontier, had commanded armies and administered justice across some of the richest territories in the known world. She believed her strength, her wealth, her strategic brilliance might protect her. She was wrong. Roman conquest did not tolerate rival powers. Roman law did not recognize foreign royalty as possessing rights beyond what Rome chose to grant them. When the Roman soldiers finally broke through her defenses and she attempted to flee toward the Persian border, the outcome was already predetermined. Zenobia found herself transformed from empress to prisoner in the span of a few hours. The legal machinery of Rome had an answer for this situation. It had been perfecting answers for centuries. Under the principle known as jus gentium, the law of nations, military defeat transformed free people into property. Once a city fell or an army surrendered, every inhabitant became legally enslaved regardless of former status. A queen commanded no more legal standing than the lowest soldier in her defeated army. Roman citizens possessed protections that shield them from certain punishments. To flog a Roman citizen was considered scandalous. To execute one without trial sparked outrage. But foreign captives, regardless of royal blood, held no such shields. They could be mistreated, displayed, sold, or killed at the discretion of their captors. Roman law made no exceptions for gender and none for nobility. The laws governing this reality dated back centuries. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code from the 5th century before the Common Era, established with brutal clarity that prisoners taken in war became the property of the Roman state. Women of royal lineage discovered that crowns offered no protection. Their former power meant nothing once chains replaced their authority. When Aurelian decided to display Zenobia in his triumph of 274 CE, the decision served multiple purposes at once. The triumphal procession had been a Roman institution for centuries, a carefully choreographed spectacle designed to communicate power to the city itself and to the world beyond its walls. The route stretched nearly 4 kilometers from the Field of Mars through the Forum and up the Capitoline Hill, passing through neighborhoods where merchants stopped their work to watch. Musicians and entertainers led the parade, their sounds carrying through the streets. Carts bearing paintings as in models of conquered cities followed, showing Palmyra's golden walls and the trading posts Zenobia had controlled. Wild animals from exotic territories were led in chains, offering Romans a glimpse of the unknown world their legions had subdued. Then came the prisoners of war, walking in shackles at the heart of the spectacle. Captured rulers marched at the front of the prisoner column, their royal garments often left intact to emphasize the magnitude of their fall. The contrast between what they had been and what they now were made more painful by the retention of these symbols of authority. Zenobia was adorned with jewels that caught the sunlight.
The Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies written in the 4th century, provides detailed accounts of her appearance in Aurelian's triumph of 274 CE. The descriptions suggest eyewitness testimony, an account of a spectacle designed to overwhelm observers with its opulence and cruelty. She was bound in massive golden chains, so heavy that guards marched beside her to help bear their weight. The choice of gold was deliberate and devastating. These were the very chains forged from the wealth she had commanded, now transformed into the instrument of her bondage. Her entire person had become a walking display of conquered riches. Ancient sources note that Zenobia maintained remarkable composure throughout the ordeal. Despite the weight of the golden chains and the hours of slow marching through hostile crowds, she carried herself with dignity. This very defiance may have saved her life. Aurelian, impressed perhaps by her bearing, or calculating that her continued existence served his purposes better than her death, spared Zenobia the execution that awaited most captive rulers. Instead, the emperor granted her a villa near Rome, where she lived out her remaining years. Some accounts claim she married a Roman senator and became part of aristocratic society, her daughters marrying into noble families. Whether this represented mercy or a more subtle form of humiliation remains debated. Zenobia spent her final decades as a living reminder of Rome's power. Her presence in Italian society, a constant demonstration that even the mightiest queens could be reduced to Roman dependence. Not every captured queen received such mercy. 50 years earlier, when King Prasutagus of the Iceni died in 60 CE,
He left a will designed to protect his kingdom and family. He bequeathed half his territory to Emperor Nero and half to his two daughters, hoping this compromise would preserve independence while satisfying Roman demands. The strategy failed catastrophically. Roman officials, led by the imperial procurator Decianus Cottus, ignored the will entirely. They seized all Iceni lands and property, declaring the entire kingdom forfeit. When Queen Boudica protested this violation of her family's will, she faced punishment that demonstrated with brutal clarity how little protection royal status afforded defeated rulers. Tacitus, whose father-in-law Agricola served in Britain during this period, recorded what followed with unusual directness for an ancient historian discussing such sensitive matters. The weight of his words suggests that even he, writing decades later, could barely find language adequate to the violations he was describing. Boudica was publicly subjected to corporal punishment in front of her people. The flogging alone represented a profound violation. To beat a Roman citizen required legal justification and procedural safeguards that would have made such treatment unthinkable. To flog a queen of an allied kingdom constituted deliberate humiliation designed to break her authority in the eyes of her own subjects. But the Romans went further, much further. Boudica's daughters, likely teenagers and certainly unmarried, were violated by Roman soldiers. Tacitus describes these assaults with sparse language that conveys his own horror at events that violated even Roman sensibilities about acceptable conduct. The restraint in his prose only emphasizes what he considered too awful to describe in detail. The historian notes that Boudica was flogged and her daughters violated, placing these crimes at the center of his explanation for the rebellion that followed. The abuse was not random violence, but calculated degradation designed to break the royal family and demonstrate Roman dominance over the Iceni. The public nature of these crimes multiplied their impact. This was not violence committed in secret, but humiliation performed before the Iceni people. By abusing the royal family in front of their subjects, Roman officials sent a message about the fate awaiting those who questioned imperial authority. The physical abuse and violation of Boudica and her daughters were meant to terrorize an entire population into submission. The strategy backfired spectacularly.
Rather than crushing resistance, the abuse of the royal family ignited a rebellion that nearly drove Rome from Britain. Boudicca raised an army that destroyed 3 Roman cities, including Londinium, massacring tens of thousands of Roman citizens and their allies. Tacitus preserves a speech he attributes to Boudicca, in which she declares that she fights not as a queen seeking to preserve her kingdom, but as a woman avenging her abused body and the violated honor of her daughters. The rebellion ended in defeat at an unknown battlefield where Roman discipline and tactical positioning overcame the far larger British forces. Tacitus claims Boudicca poisoned herself rather than face capture. The fate of her daughters goes unrecorded. They vanish from historical accounts after the initial violation, their stories lost to silence. The system that broke these queens followed predictable patterns, patterns refined through centuries of conquest and consolidations of power. When triumphal processions wound through Rome toward the Capitoline Hill, captive rulers knew their journey might end at the Mamertine prison. Known in Latin as the Talannum, this ancient structure built into the northeastern slope of the Capitoline served as the final stop for Rome's most notable enemies. Perhaps final is the right word. While the triumph continued to the Temple of Jupiter, where the victorious general would make offerings to the gods, condemned prisoners were led aside to face execution out of sight. The Talannum consisted of 2 levels, a design that made the system efficient. The upper chamber served as a holding cell where prisoners might spend their final hours uncertain of their fate. But the lower dungeon, accessible only through a hole in the ceiling, became the execution chamber. Here, in darkness so complete that torches were required even in daylight, in filth that accumulated from decades of human effluence and suffering, Rome's enemies met their end. The method varied according to the particular circumstances and the status of the prisoner. Some were executed by suffocation, others were left to starve. A few were simply executed and disposed of, their remains never properly buried. The process remained deliberately hidden from public view, occurring while crowds celebrated on the streets above, while the triumph continued its leisurely procession, while merchants returned to their shops and children went home for dinner. What happened below remained below. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who had unified the tribes of Gaul against Julius Caesar, exemplified this fate. After his defeat at Alesia in 52 BCE, Caesar held him in prison for 6 years before finally parading him through Rome in the triumph of 46 BCE. The Gallic leader, once vigorous and commanding, had deteriorated during his captivity until he appeared as a broken figure before the Roman crowds. After the procession, he was led to the Talannum and executed. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, met a similarly brutal end following Marius's triumph in 104 BCE. According to ancient accounts, when he was lowered into the Talannum's lower chamber, the king went mad with terror. He was left to starve to death over 6 days, his cries echoing through the stone walls, while Rome celebrated above. The historian Plutarch recorded his final words, reportedly asking in delirium how cold this Roman bath was.
Ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, was displayed in Titus's triumph before being executed at the traditional site in the Forum. Josephus documented how the triumphal procession paused at the Temple of Jupiter while messengers awaited word that the execution had been carried out. Only after confirmation of the enemy leader's death did the ceremonies conclude. Not every captive ruler faced immediate execution. The decision rested with the triumphant general and increasingly under the empire with the emperor himself. Some prisoners proved more valuable alive, serving as permanent symbols of Roman victory or as bargaining tools in future negotiations. But for those marked for death, the triumph offered only a temporary reprieve before the descent into the Tullianum's darkness. The legal framework that enabled this treatment was not accidental. It was deliberately constructed.
Roman law, one of history's most celebrated legal systems, contained within it the seeds of absolute cruelty toward the defeated. The principle of jus gentium appeared neutral and logical. War created victors and vanquished. The vanquished became property. Simple mathematics, except it was anything but simple. When you were the queen being dragged through the streets in chains, when your daughters were being violated in front of your people, when you were descending into a dungeon where light did not penetrate and hope evaporated with each step downward. What made this system effective was its efficiency. Legal protections evaporated at conquest boundary. Dignity dissolved in defeat. The documented cases force us to confront the deliberate cruelty embedded in Roman expansion. The flogging of Boudica, the golden chains on Zenobia, the executions following triumphs were not aberrations, but calculated policies. The message to rivals was explicit. This is what happens to those who resist. This is what happens to women who dare to rule. The systematic humiliation of defeated royalty shaped the fears that kept Rome's enemies compliant for centuries. Queens hearing of Boudica's violation understood the cost of resistance. Rulers seeing Zenobia's golden chains grasped the impossibility of escaping Roman reach. Kings descending into the Tullianum's darkness knew that no earthly power could save them. The triumphs were built on human suffering. Queens reduced to spectacles, their degradation transformed into entertainment. The walls of the Mamertine prison still stand in Rome. Tourists walk past without understanding. The triumph, celebrated as civilization's achievement, was built on systematic cruelty. The Roman legal system that so many modern systems emulated contained this darkness. It protected some while offering absolute vulnerability to others. This is how power operates, not through random cruelty, but through systems that make certain things legal and others impossible. Through laws that protect the powerful while rendering the powerless defenseless. Boudica's rebellion shows what happens when the system overreaches, when violence becomes too visible and victims too sympathetic to ignore. Rome learned they became more careful about whom they humiliated. Zenobia, commanding perhaps equal threat to Boudica, was spared the worst treatment. The system evolved. This pattern extends far beyond ancient Rome. The logic that made it acceptable to chain queens because they were foreigners survives in different forms. The belief that military defeat removes all moral restraint survives. The practice of using visible humiliation as a tool of control survives. What makes this history relevant centuries later is precisely that the system that produced it was not unique to Rome. It emerges whenever certain conditions align, when a society develops the legal and military infrastructure to dominate others, when triumph becomes more important than truth, when the defeated can be transformed into objects without rights, when crowds gather to watch humiliation and call it justice, when those responsible can return home and sleep soundly because their actions occurred within legal frameworks. Enough people are complicit in quiet ways that widespread violence becomes possible. Rome conquered the Mediterranean world not because Roman soldiers were uniquely cruel, but because Rome created systems that transformed cruelty into policy and policy into sign of civilization. The stone walls that held Jugurtha as he starved still stand. They stand as a reminder that the triumph celebrated in ancient texts was built on what occurred in those cells. They stand as a question about what systems we have created that appear normal and necessary to us now, but which future generations will recognize as barbaric. They stand as a warning that the degradation of the defeated, the humiliation of the powerless, the reduction of human beings to objects for spectacle follows patterns as old as civilization itself. And those patterns persist unless and until we recognize them and choose to break.